Hi everybody. Last week I burdened you with a video that was so long I had to get special permission from YouTube to publish it. So this week I'm going to be much shorter. This week our topic, we're in week 5, and this week our topic is victims, crime victims. Until very recently, to be brutally honest, the law didn't care much about victims one way or the other. They weren't taken into account. They were not important in the criminal law. They were useful to law enforcement personnel and to prosecutors only as potential witnesses at the trial. No thought was given to how the crime had, no thought was given by the law. I don't mean by anybody, but by the law, to how the crime had affected the victims, to what they were suffering as a result of the crime, to any obligation that the state might have to compensate them for whatever suffering they had. None of that was even on the table as a point of discussion. So this whole area that we're talking about in week 5 is really fairly new to the law. We are only recently, as a society, becoming aware that perhaps we have, or the state has, an obligation toward these crime victims. And then we have to ask ourselves, is the answer to the question, do we have an obligation, is yes. Then we have to ask ourselves what that obligation is. How far does it go? Does it mean just throwing money at the victims? Which sometimes is quite welcome and useful, but is it enough? What other obligations does the state have toward crime victims? One of the topics this week that you're going to be dealing with in your discussion board is whether it might be a good idea to amend the United States Constitution to include some kind of recognition of a governmental obligation toward crime victims. That is not as far-fetched as you might think, because most states have already done that in their own state constitutions. Your readings this week give you a link toward to how each state has dealt with this topic. And in my written announcement, I have reproduced the section of the Virginia Constitution that has that deals with the state's obligation to crime victims. I chose Virginia just because that happens to be where I am. And I couldn't do all 50 states because that would have made my written announcement even longer than it really is. You don't want me to do that. So just read your own states or whatever states treatment you're interested in. I provided the Virginia one only as an example. You don't need to pay particular attention to that. It is, however, fairly typical of how a state has chosen to acknowledge a certain public responsibility toward crime victims. We have an obligation, I think it's normally acknowledged that we have an obligation as law enforcement professionals or legal professionals to keep crime victims informed of the whereabouts of the people who have committed crimes against them. Is the person in prison? Is the person still in prison? Is the person about to be released from prison? If so, when will that release take place? Where will the person be housed? Will there be any restrictions on that housing after the release? The location of the perpetrator is usually of great concern to victims. This is especially true, but not only true, of victims of sexual violence, rape victims, child abuse victims, and so forth. It's extremely important to them and to us as a society that they be kept informed of what happens to the people who have harmed them after they've been released from prison. The next, I really do want to keep this short. I really apologize for the length of last week's video. This week's blog involves victims as well and asks that you do a little bit of research into the legal protections that your state has in place for victims of crime, and how those victims' rights have changed in the 20th and 21st centuries. This whole recognition, excuse me, this whole recognition that the state has some obligations to crime victims came about in the very late 20th century. It is a new, in the eyes of the law, it's extremely new construct. So late 20th century and early 21st century, which is where we are now, is when these obligations have started to be acknowledged at the state level. They have not yet been acknowledged in terms of a federal constitutional amendment, but that's a possibility. And your opinion on whether that possibility is a good one is part of your assignment for the discussion board. Make sure that you discuss how your state deals with the crime victims, crime victim compensation and acknowledgement. And then we switch gears away from crime victims and back to our final project. Of course, you have chosen a particular case scenario to address in your final project. This week, you're going to be dealing with milestone 3 leading toward that project. And milestone 3 asks you to identify the ethical theories that apply to the scenario you've chosen, why they apply, how they apply. And here's the interesting philosophical part of this milestone. You are also asked to distinguish your personal morals from your ethical obligations as a professional. Sometimes they dovetail. That's good. That's easy. That's comfortable. Sometimes they don't. And the question for this milestone, and for you to think about for your professional career really, is when there's a conflict between your personal moral code and your ethical obligations as a professional, which one of those should prevail? And how are your actions guided by your personal morals and by your ethical obligations? There are readings that go along with this, but primarily what you're going to be doing is researching the actual ethical obligations that apply to the scenario you've chosen, how those ethical obligations apply, and if those ethical obligations conflict with your own personal moral code, which you should follow. The second interesting philosophical question, and only you can answer this, is should your actions ever be guided by your personal morals rather than your ethical obligations? That's a difficult question. Most of us tend, without much thinking really, to follow whatever our personal moral code is in our actions, and we may not even consciously realize that's what we're doing. But if you are, if you are bound by a professional code of ethics, and there are elements of that code that conflict with your own personal morals, should you ever let your morals guide you instead? I'm going to leave you with that question. And be quiet. I hope you have a great week, and let me know if you have any questions.